Put butter in my Donald's brose, or for all that and all that, it was called in the Merry Muses of Caledonia, a collection of his bawdy songs which were published after his death. Now, it was his collection. Some he had simply collected and transcribed, some he had revised, and some he wrote all of. I believe he wrote all of this one, except for the for all that phrase, which was traditional. So, put butter in my Donald's brose. Brose is oats and water, and that's a metaphor. There's a song called Brose and Butter. It has to do with mixing the sexual fluids. For weel does Donald fa that, well does Donald fall that deserve that. Donald swore a solemn oath by his first hairy gravat. A gravat is a neck muffler, usually made of wood, but this is hairy, so you get the picture. Twice as meikles are, that means twice as much, and a skelpit doup is a sore ass. A pintle. Donald had a pintle like a roaring pin. A pintle is a penis, and roaring is active, energetic, and a pin was used for anything that was used for closing or filling a hole. She nicher'd. Nicher'd is like a horse nickering or whinnying. Woo! So claw is to stroke gently. It's not this. It's to stroke. The deevil's dizzen, the devil's dozen. That's 13 inches. So, if you haven't gathered by now, this is a bawdy song with some language to it. Put butter in MacDonald's brose, for weel does Donald for that. Halloo, MacDonald's tartans weel his naked arse and all that. For all that and twice as meikle's all that. The lassie got a skelpit doup, but won the day for all that. For Donald swore a solemn aith by his first hairy gravat, that he would fecht the battle there and stick the lass and all that. For all that and twice as meikle's all that. The lassie got a skelpit doup, but won the day for all that. His hairy bollocks, side and wide, hang like a beggar's wallet. A pintle like a roaring pin, she nicher'd when she saw that. For all that and twice as meikle's all that. The lassie got a skelpit doup, but won the day for all that. Then she turned up her hairy cunt, and she bade Donald claw that. The deevil's dizzen Donald drew, and Donald gied her all that. For all that and twice as meikle's all that. The lassie got a skelpit doup, but won the day for all that. Well, if you have any Burns editions other than the Merry Muses, you won't have run into this song. Burns's editors have managed, until now, really, to repress his role, the extent of his role in his own collection of songs. And I'll give you some history on it. Burns referred to his collection in a couple of letters to friends, saying, one, he lent them the collection for 5 or 6 days, and he said 5 or 6 views will satisfy you. And another one said, "Oh, I've mentioned my collection. Come and see my collection." So Burns was a collector of folk songs. He was doing this for the Scots Musical Museum, his publisher, and he would collect. Some were just taken from tradition, some were revised and filled out, and some were his own lyrics, entirely written to melodies. And the Merry Muses of Caledonia is much like that. Now, he was very careful about who he showed his collection to, because it would have harmed his reputation as a poet and possibly his employment with the government as a tax assessor for the British Crown, an exciseman, a gauger. So, not only the bawdy songs, but his more radical political lyrics also were sometimes published anonymously. In this case, these were obviously not published in his life. 3 years after he died, they were published in a collection called the Merry Muses of Caledonia, which I don't believe was his title. Caledonia is the old Latin name for Scotland, excuse me. In January of 1787, Burns joined a convivial club in Edinburgh. It was after the first blush of his poetic fame. I mean, he really went from being a poor farmer who was making plans to emigrate to Jamaica to a national celebrity. And he was in Edinburgh and joined this convivial group of a social club, men's get together, and it was called the Calhoun Fencibles. Fencibles were volunteers in defense of the nation. Calhoun was from a Gaelic song which meant, Colin's cattle, which was a song that was sung by the bartender, the owner of the tavern. Anyway, the Calhoun Fencibles. So Burns was an active member for a year and a half, and then he moved to the farm at Ellisland, and after that to Dumfries. He was not often in Edinburgh after that. But, so the Calhoun Fencibles was founded by a man named William Smellie, who was a printer and kind of a polymath. I think he's one of the editors of the first Encyclopedia Britannica. Also a fan of bawdy songs like Burns. He died in 1795. Burns died in 1796. The club had disbanded, but his friends got together, and this may have been as a fundraiser for his widow. The Merry Muses of Caledonia was published in 1799 in 600 copies. Only 2 of these survived the Victorian era. It was so scandalous. In 1800, why am I telling you about the Calhoun Fencibles? The title of this was The Merry Muses of Caledonia, a collection of Scots songs, ancient and modern, selected for use of the Calhoun Fencibles. Now, I believe that's a bit of creative misdirection to protect Burns's reputation. It didn't mention his name at all. 4 or 5 of these songs had been published in the Scots Musical Museum, but none had been credited to Burns there. He generally published his revisions of folk songs anonymously. So, in 1800, James Curry, his first biographer, Life and Works of Robert Burns, had the scrapings of his desk and so on. He published one of these letters that Burns wrote to his friends about his collection. "You must see my collection." And he added his own words to it. "Only a very few are my own." He put those in as if Burns had written them. And this deceived people until 1931, until J. Delancey Ferguson found the letter in the Library of the Union Club in Utica, New York. For some reason, he finds Burns's original letter there, and it didn't have those words in it. He was not denying that he wrote the songs there. So, I'm not saying he wrote all of the songs. I'm saying he wrote this one and many others which have not been credited to him. And that's a long story. I'm working on an article for a publisher in Scotland, which, when it's more concretized, I can tell you about. But anyway, in 1911, Duncan MacNaught published the Merry Muses of Caledonia for the Burns Federation, a vindication of Robert Burns, and he used that, a very few of my own, as corroboration that, poor Burns had collected these erotic lyrics. Well, the story goes on, really, of repressing and minimizing Burns's role. Now, James Kinsley published what's considered the definitive edition of Burns in 1968. That's the word you see, definitive. It is, in fact, conservative. When Kinsley didn't have a manuscript, he looked for any reason to reject a song. He completely did not want to make a mistake, and in doing so, he kind of threw out the baby with the bathwater, including 6 better versions of A Man's a Man for All That were published of necessity in chapbooks and anonymously, because they would have gotten Burns fired from his job and possibly deported. They don't say a prince can make a belted knight. They say the king can make a belted knight, but an honest man's above his might. That would have cost Burns his security, injured his family, and so on. So these things should be published. And I'm going to just talk about one instance of this song. Kinsley published a token number of 3 lyrics from the Merry Muses. Whall Mow Me Now, which everyone agrees is by Burns. The Jolly Gauger, because Burns was a tax assessor. I don't think he wrote much of it. He just took it from the Jolly Beggar. And then one called Gied Lasser Farron. This made it look to people like, oh, Kinsley, the definitive editor, has made his judgments about what Burns wrote, and so we're going with his judgment. Kins doesn't have a lot of literary judgment in terms of understanding Burns's writing voice. That sounds like a radical thing to say, but you'll understand more as time goes by, if you follow the channel. So in this case, this is one of 10 songs. There are 89 lyrics in the Merry Muses. And so Kinsley says, oh, here are 10 which have been attributed to the Burns canon previously, in other words, by previous editors. And he goes on to reject all of them. And he says, oh, no evidence, without evidence, or it's traditional. Well, the fact that they're in the Merry Muses is evidence of Burns's involvement in the first place. You've got to make a decision, because we don't have the manuscripts, many of which were burned, and we have a record of the person who burned them, Mr. Greenshields in 1871. I have made a bonfire of them, and so ends the matter. He had bought these manuscripts. William Scott Douglas reported that. But I want to go over this song, particularly because what Burns says about it is, the imagery of the song has a Burnsian power, but so has that of the best traditional bawdry. Is this traditional bawdry? While the Merry Muses is not primarily a repository of traditional bawdry, it does provide enough examples to contrast their lyrical quality with Burns's more sophisticated literary techniques. So I'm going to quote you the first 2 stanzas of Ye's Get a Hole to Hide It In from the museum. So this is a song Burns collected and did not rewrite, and you can tell the difference. A town is a farm. Ye's means ye shall. O will ye speak at our tune as ye come frae the fair, and ye's get a hole to hide it in. Ye's get a hole to hide it in. Will ye speak at our tune as ye come frae the fair, and ye's get a hole to hide it in. We'll hold it all and mair. We'll hold it all and more. Oh, hold awa your hands, sir. but go on me. Ye gar me, I think, shame. And ye's get a hole to hide it in, ye's get a hole to hide it in. Oh, horrowa your hand, sir. Ye gar me, I think, shame, and ye's get a hole to hide it in, and think yoursel at hame. Simple end rhymes are a distinctive feature of folk songs from oral tradition. Mosaic rhymes, rhyming, with both syllables of a word with two words, like that, such as gravat and that, wallet and saw that, represent the work of a literate poet. One does not find the word gravat in folk songs. I've been listening to them all my life. I say that Burns wrote this song. Now, Burns wrote that he sent to his second publisher this note that a poet knows anything of his trade, will husband his best thoughts for a concluding stroke. And he often did this. He concentrated the linguistic effects at the end of the song. In this case, all these D's, all this alliteration, the deevils, dizzen, Donald Drew, and Donald gied all that. That's the concluding, quite literal stroke. And it makes hilarious use of the old song form. For all that, in the old song, it was just general, like for everything that's going on. And this Donald gied her all that, he gave her all that. It's just funny as hell. So, one more piece of evidence that it's Burns' song, even though we don't have the manuscript. I feel that the Merry Muses, a lot of Burns' editors got creative and rewrote and Baudelarized. The Merry Muses was transcribed by a poor speller with some weird punctuation, but it's a faithful transcription. When you spend time with it, you start to feel good, except, there's a couple really awful pieces in there, which I want to acknowledge without ever singing them. Anyway, Burns's handwriting often includes, at particular exciting moments, 3 spaced exclamation marks. So I'll have the last word, then there'll be a space, exclamation, space, exclamation point, space, exclamation point. So in the Glenn Riddell manuscript, I give and take with Anna, 3 spaced exclamation points. I shall try, 3 spaced exclamation points. And grind them in the mire, 3 spaced exclamation points. In the song I sang you, she nicher'd when she saw that, space, exclamation point, space, exclamation point, space, exclamation point. This is a Burns song. Please subscribe. Stay tuned for more. Thank you for listening. Be well.